The evening began innocently enough, with laughter echoing through our living room as I poured another glass of wine for my husband, Mark, and his best friend, Jake. They had been friends since college, sharing good times and bad, and through it all I felt the easy, comfortable camaraderie between them. As the hours passed and the alcohol flowed, I felt a creeping sense of excitement mixed with dread at the back of my mind. The three of us had spent countless weekends together, game nights, barbecues, and film marathons. But it wasn't until that fateful Friday night that everything I thought I knew about my life was about to change. The atmosphere was electric, charged with the kind of friendship that often teeters on the edge of something more. I'd always thought of Jake as a friend, but as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. As the evening wore on, we fell into a familiar routine, the boys joking and wrestling playfully, while I found comfort in my role as supportive spouse, lightly teasing and laughing along. But as I watched them, something stirred in me, a subtle desire I couldn't quite put my finger on, something that seemed to be just below the surface. Finally, Mark decided to call it a day. He was tired, leaning back in his chair and yawning. "Jake, you need to go home," he said, looking at his best friend. "But you can crash here if you're too drunk to drive." Jake laughed, shrugging off the suggestion. "Nah, I'll be fine. Just give me a minute to finish my drink." He raised his glass in a mock toast, a playful glint in his eye. I felt a tension in the air, an undercurrent of something unspoken. Eventually, Mark went into the bedroom, leaving Jake and me alone in the living room. The atmosphere changed. With Mark out of the picture, I could feel the tension in the air thickening. Jake looked at me, his gaze lingering a little too long, sending a shiver down my spine. "You okay?" he asked, a teasing smile on his lips. "Yeah, just, a bit buzzed," I replied, a nervous laugh escaping my lips. Jake laughed too, and we settled into a comfortable silence. But this silence felt charged, heavy with possibilities. As he poured himself another glass, I caught a lingering look from him, a moment when our eyes locked and the world seemed to stand still. I should have been thinking about Mark, about my marriage, but instead my mind wandered. Jake was handsome, with a wild charisma that had always drawn people to him. It was easy to get lost in that charm, especially at a moment like this when the lines were starting to blur. The kind of lines you never mean to cross, but lose sight of when you're tipsy and vulnerable. "Hey, remember that time we went camping and you almost fell in the lake?" Jake asked, a hint of nostalgia in his voice. I couldn't help but laugh, remembering the ridiculousness of that trip. "Yeah, and you pushed me," I replied, shaking my head. We laughed, and the laughter turned into something else, something deeper, more intimate. I realized that our friendship was built on years of shared experiences, and in that moment, it felt as if all that history was drawing us closer together. There was a tension in the air as our laughter faded. There was a shift, and I could feel my pulse quickening. Before I knew it, I was flirting back. The playful banter turned into lingering touches, fleeting moments when our bodies almost brushed against each other. "What if we had taken a real trip together?" he whispered, leaning closer, his breath warm against my ear. The room felt small, and suddenly the drink in my hand felt heavier than before. "Jake, we shouldn't," I started, but he stopped me by gently placing a finger on my lips. "Shh, just for tonight," he said, his voice deep and intoxicating. "Nothing has to change." In that moment, the logic of right and wrong vanished. All the years of friendship, loyalty, and commitment melted away. In the heat of the moment, I caught my breath and looked into his eyes, searching for any sign of regret or hesitation. Instead, I found nothing but desire reflected back at me. Before I could think, I found myself leaning in, and within seconds our lips were locked. It felt exhilarating and terrifying, a whirlwind of emotions that both thrilled and terrified me. I felt the softness of his lips against mine, igniting a fire that had been dormant for too long. The kiss deepened, and the world around us melted away. All that existed was the two of us, trapped in a moment that felt both forbidden and electrifying. The initial shock faded, replaced by an urgency I couldn't explain. It was reckless and I knew it. I was betraying the man I loved, yet I felt as if I were in a daze, caught in a whirlwind where nothing mattered but the person in front of me. "What are we doing?" I gasped between kisses, a mixture of excitement and panic coursing through me. "Just enjoy it," he murmured, pulling me closer. "Just for tonight." And like a moth to a flame, I couldn't resist. With Mark asleep in the room, I surrendered to the moment. The drunken haze clouded my mind, and everything became a blur of passion and longing. We finally moved into the bedroom, and as I stumbled onto the bed, my heart raced with a mixture of excitement and fear. The reality of the situation was sinking in with every passing second. I was about to cross a line so thick it would change everything. Hours passed in a flurry of passion that I could barely remember. Jake was gentle, yet passionate, and it felt so intoxicating that I lost myself in the ebb and flow of desire. Every touch, every kiss felt electric, and I felt a perverse thrill at the danger of what we were doing. I was drowning in the ecstasy of the moment, betraying my marriage vows and everything I had ever stood for. But as dawn began to creep through the bedroom window, I felt the weight of reality crashing down on me. The warmth of the night faded, replaced by a tangled web of guilt and disbelief. As the sun's first rays illuminated the truth, what had I done? I managed to slip out of bed quietly, panic settling in as I dressed, my heart pounding in my chest. I glanced back at Jake, who was still fast asleep carefree in my slumber. I felt a tightening in my chest, a sense of foreboding clinging to me like a shadow. The reality of what we had done weighed heavily in the air, suffocating the lightness I had felt only hours before. As I sat on the edge of the bed staring at the floor, my thoughts began to spin. How could I face Mark after this? How could I ever look him in the eye again? I had shattered the trust in my marriage, and all for what? A moment of weakness fueled by alcohol and the lure of something forbidden. Before I could sink any deeper into despair, I heard a noise from the living room. Mark was awake. Adrenaline surged through me and I quickly gathered my things, my hands shaking as I dressed. I had to get away before he discovered what I had done, how I had betrayed him in the worst possible way. I made it to the door just as Mark stepped out of the hallway, running a hand through his disheveled hair, his eyes still blurred from sleep. "Hey, you're up early," he said, a sleepy smile on his face. Yeah, just getting some fresh air," I replied, forcing a smile that felt like it was made of glass. I slipped out the door before he could ask any more questions, my heart racing as I fled to my car parked outside. I drove through the streets of our neighborhood, the bright morning sun doing little to lift my spirits. Guilt clawed at my insides, and the truth weighed heavily on my conscience. How could I have let it come to this? How could I have thrown it all away? The days that followed were a blur of confusion and remorse. I avoided Jake's calls, unable to face the consequences of our actions. I went through the motions of everyday life while a strange guilt settled in my chest. Mark deserved better. He had always been loving and supportive, and now I had betrayed him in a way that felt unforgivable. Eventually, Jake reached out to me and I felt consumed by fear. He wanted to talk about that night, about what it had meant, but I knew it couldn't happen again. I pushed him away, reminding myself that we had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. My marriage was on the line and I had to fight for what was right. Instead of a heartfelt conversation, I wrote him a text that made my heart race. "I can't do this anymore. What happened was a mistake. I love Mark and I'm sorry." The reply came quickly. "I know, I just couldn't help myself. Let's just forget it ever happened." But I couldn't forget. The weight of that night would always be with me. I had to tell Mark the truth, confess what I had done. Each passing day filled me with dread, and as the weeks turned into months, the burden of my secret felt heavier than ever. One evening, as we sat together on the sofa, the flickering light from the television casting a soft glow over our faces. I felt the knot in my stomach tighten. My heart was pounding, and I felt the urge to confess squeeze my chest. "Mark, I need to talk to you about something," I finally managed, forcing myself to look into his worried eyes. "What is it?" he asked, sensing the seriousness in my tone. And as I took a deep breath, I realized that the truth was the only way forward. I made a mistake. I slept with Jake. His face fell. The breath left his body in an instant. The pain in his eyes cut me deeper than any physical wound could. It was a moment I would never forget, watching the man I loved collapse in front of me, shattering everything we had built. "A mistake? How could you do this after everything?" he asked, disbelief etched into his face. "I'm so sorry," I pleaded, tears streaming down my cheeks. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know that it meant nothing. I love you, Mark. You have to believe me." But there was a coldness in his eyes I had never seen before, a wall erected to protect him from the pain I had caused. "You've broken something between us, something I can't fix." It was then that I realized the gravity of my actions. The bridge I had burned could never be rebuilt. The trust was gone. I could see the chapter of our relationship closing, and it felt like a painful goodbye. The acceptance of my betrayal would haunt me for years to come, twisting in my heart like a dagger and changing the course of my life forever. In the end, I learned that passion can be intoxicating, but it's the loyalty and commitment to the bonds of love that truly matter. I sacrificed everything in a moment of weakness, and as I watched the love of my life walk away, I was left with an unrelenting sense of remorse and regret for what once was, all because of a drunken night I would never be able to erase from my memory.